ready.
Can't have my cell phones on me, can I? Oh my goodness. Let's put that over there and see if this still works. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1:30. We do have quorum. I'll call the council workshop to order. In accordance with the town's procedure bylaw, no decisions are to be made, but rather this meeting is an opportunity for council to have an informal discussion regarding various matters. And in this case, there will be two matters that we'll be looking at. One is the asset management strategy, and the other one is the 2017 budget fiscal sustainability pillars. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Nohammer for introductory comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And as you indicated, today is a workshop setting, so we don't expect any decisions from committee or council today, but we will be having two presentations, as you alluded to. What I would request is that if we could, if at all possible, hold questions till the end of each presentation, then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of each presenter. As we did last week at the workshop on the operating budget, if at today's workshop on the capital budget, if more information is required or if there are any questions that we're unable to answer today, we do commit to coming forward with additional information as part of the preliminary budget submission in December on both the operating and capital budget. So our first presentation will be on asset management strategy, and I'd like to introduce Lisa Ellis as the chair of the Asset Management Committee here at the town, and Dean Rurak of Yaku Consulting, who's been working with us on developing the asset management strategy. And I'll ask Lisa to say a few introductory remarks.
There we go.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, members of Council. Thank you on behalf of the committee for this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about our asset management strategy. As you may be aware, back in February, on February 8th, Council adopted our asset management policy. At that time, Report 2016-01 indicated that staff would be going out with an RFP for an asset management strategy or consultant. Our consultant is with us today of Yaku Consulting, Dean Rurak. And the purpose of the strategy was help us to build our processes, tools, and resources for the future. We indicated in that report that we would be coming back at the end of phase 1 to provide you with the next steps for implementation, as well as the operationalization of that strategy. And that is the purpose of our presentation today. So I will hand it over to Dean for further analysis.
Good. So before we do that, I still need to, protocol require that I ask if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest. Being none, go ahead, Dean.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Van Bynen and members of Council. Just to reiterate, I thank you for the opportunity to present on the strategy, which we've worked with our associate company, Cole Engineering, and many members of the town staff in producing over the last several months. Our agenda today covers off 9 topics, the first 3 of which lay out the background for the project, the rationale for completing it, and a little bit about why we should invest in asset management. The last 6 really speak to the results from the asset management strategy itself. So the reason for the project really is to help the town with its asset management program, and it's part of a package of asset management initiatives that the town has already undertaken as a result of some strategic priorities that the town set out. So under the theme of efficiency financial management, town staff identified that asset management programs, asset management plans, asset management policies, and now this asset management strategy would help the town achieve the objectives under efficiency and financial management. The objectives for the project are really, this is identified as an essential first step in implementing a strategy for the development of a fulsome asset management program. So it's, as a program, it's expected to balance leading practices in asset management or managing assets, together with the requirements and expectations of the town as a whole. The approach to the project really covers off our 6 points from the agenda, which is a typical strategic planning process to understand the context for the town, what's currently driving it, what its vision is, what best practices there are, and a comparison of current state against those best practices to identify the gap. And then from the gap to identify things that could be done to close the gap and improve the program. We synthesize that together into a comprehensive plan and then schedule it out over an acceptable period of time that allows the town to proceed in an orderly fashion. So those are our 6 steps for the process, and our agenda will follow that after we talk a little bit first about the project approach. In doing this, we did follow these 6 steps. We did it through a workshop process to get awareness amongst a wide variety of town staff and have them participate as much as possible in the process of understanding asset management best practice and the town's current practice. So this is a discovery process to identify what's currently being done in comparison with the best practice. And then we evaluate the opportunities or gaps between current and best practice. We identify town's priorities based on their drivers, and then we try to make a match between the gap and the priorities to have a nice sequential plan for improvement. We also like to factor in, of course, the vision for where the town would like to be with respect to asset management and the resources available to the town to do so. So next we're going to talk about the case for asset management. To just, if you haven't had a chance to review the material, we are recommending a rather lengthy program and a significant expenditure over about 5 years of $1 million, and some recommendations for new staff. So bearing that in mind, we have to establish a business case, if you will, or the case for asset management. So on the board right now is a number of different areas that are driving asset management, not specifically just in the town of Newmarket, but across North America and indeed the world. So we have a lot of competing priorities right now for funding, and oftentimes there's a bias towards the lowest initial cost as opposed to looking at the whole life cycle cost. There's various external factors like climate change, sustainability that are impacting our assets and our ability to deliver service. And of course, there's economic challenges. It's increasingly difficult to fund infrastructure when the economic climate is uncertain. And there's also a skill requirement around asset management practices and putting it into place. So there's a deficit in that area as well that we need to consider. So those are sort of broad factors affecting assets and delivery of municipal services. So the case for asset management is that it can help us systematically address these issues and provides us some rigor to how we're doing things and some transparency around the decisions that we're making. So we understand the risks and we manage them. We have our performance of assets and service aligned with service outcomes. And we've optimized the total cost of asset ownership and our service delivery. So an asset management system or asset management program is going to help us to do these things. And there's some core activities, core asset management activities, which this slide depicts. So we have our asset portfolio. It seems rather simple to say, well, we understand that the assets that we own, but it's not just counting them up, but also understanding their behavior and organizing that information to good effect so that we understand risk of assets or the risk to each asset and how important it is in the overall context of the town, so that we can compare road assets with water assets, with facility assets, et cetera. So we have service levels which really depict not just how we're delivering the service, but how we're managing the assets, and that's where the asset strategy comes into play. Making decisions about how much maintenance to put into place, how much and what type of rehabilitation and upgrade we should consider, and then understanding all of that information. And we want to plug that into some form of predictive analysis, because it's not just about today that we're concerned. Since we have assets that live a long time, we want to be concerned about what's the picture going to look like in 20 years and 50 years and 100 years. So we want to understand those financial implications. That's where the predictive analysis comes into play. We need some advanced software to help us do that. We can plug that all in and output a list of projects based on our decision-making criteria. And then we want to optimize that amongst competing priorities. So in a simplest form, we end up with a capital plan. There's much more in asset management than a capital plan, but that is a key output. So we have all of this formed together, and the result with good asset management practices is transparent evidence of the service level being delivered and the outcome with the full or partial funding in place. And our next slide is going to give an example using some current information from the plan. So this is a somewhat complicated slide. There's three pieces of information here. On our y-axis, we have the total value of assets on the x-axis in each of 5 different condition states. Okay, so without considering the color for the moment, we look at this, and as an example, we look at condition state 3, which is about the middle between best and worst. We have a total asset value of about $90 million. Okay, so that's the Town of Newmarket's road assets. There's about, we're suggesting that in 2025, based on the current plan, there'll be about $90 million of road assets in condition state 3. There'll be about $10 million in condition state 1, and so forth. Okay, so now the third piece of information that we want to be mindful of is not every road is equal, so we use color to understand most to least important assets. So again, looking at condition 3, of the 90 million that are in condition state 3, the light blue represents the least important of the road assets, and the sort of salmon color represents the most important. So we can see the distribution in condition state 3, that there's a lot of assets that are least important that are in that condition, and a few that are in, like if we look at condition importance level 4, very, very few assets of that condition state. And so the overall conclusion, if we follow the current plan, in 2025, what we'll end up with is some of the most important road assets, which are the salmon and the green, will be in the poorest condition. Okay? That's the current plan, and I would suggest that undoubtedly, before you actually got to that state, I'm sure that the town staff would be aware of it and would take action to prevent that from happening. But as it's laid out currently, that's what will occur in 2025. Okay? So that's 3 pieces of information: the value, the condition, and the importance. Okay? So now there's embedded within this current plan is information about when to do a road resurfacing or when to do a road reconstruction. So what we've done is we've taken that decision and we've applied it in an unconstrained state to say, well, we're not going to constrain and spend only $26 million, but rather we're going to follow the rules and see what the result is in 10 years. And what that tells us is that over 10 years, following those rules already set up in the current plan, you'd need to spend about $64 million, and you'd end up with a dark blue condition state. Okay, so here we're not showing importance of asset, we're only showing total spending and total condition. So you can see that obviously with more spending, you're going to have less assets in poor condition. You're going to end up with assets that are in no worse condition than condition state 3. Okay, so that might be fine and appropriate, and this is where service levels come into play. And the obvious question, do we really need that high of a service level? Do we really need to spend that much money? And that's where the asset management comes into play. So we can start doing some further analysis to say, well, let's do some scenario analysis. We think that we might have a problem spending $26 million over 10 years. We're certainly going to have a problem spending $64 million. So is there some place that we can saw off in between? And what we have on the left on this slide is the original information from the current plan, with on the right-hand side some scenario analysis where we say, well, we're going to spend the $37 million, which is $11 million more than the 10-year capital plan, but we're going to do it in such a way that we're going to focus on the most important assets. So here's where we're going to say, we're going to differentiate, and for roads that we deem more important, let's say Eagle Street versus a cul-de-sac, we're going to let the cul-de-sac be in a lesser state of condition than Eagle Street. So we want to spend our money wisely, and what we end up with by doing that, yes, spending more, but also spending a little bit differently. And the bottom line is that none of the most important assets are in the poorest condition. That in 10 years, now remember that this is just a snapshot in time and every year it changes, but in 10 years, your most important assets are going to be in a condition state of 1 or 2, and your least important we're going to allow to go to a condition state of 4, but none will allow to go to a condition state of 5, which is the worst. Okay, so that was a lot of information. The idea was really to show how to use asset management to help decide where to spend the money, And most importantly, by having these rules set out in place, as well as a predictive analysis, deterioration curve, et cetera, you're able to show the evidence for why you're making the decisions that you are making. And it allows you to communicate with your customers, the ratepayers, et cetera, to say, well, here's our decision-making process, here's how we're making the decision, and here's the conditions that we've deemed to be acceptable. If you have a difference of opinion, then by all means, let's hear it, but understand that by having a higher level of service, it's going to mean higher costs. So that's the case for asset management and how to use it to help communicate and spend wisely. So next we want to talk about, when we get into the actual project output, we look at the context of the town. And there's two aspects that we want to consider here. There's a lot more that went into this than these next two slides, but really, what's our vision for asset management? And the vision as outlined here really speaks to being able to do those things that were illustrated as an example on the preceding slides. So we want to have, we being the town, want to have a robust asset management program that we can use to communicate with the public and help manage the assets to an acceptable level of service. And the last part, obviously, at an acceptable cost. And the other part of context is what's influencing the town. There's a number of typical drivers. These are the top 7 ranked drivers for the town as ranked by the staff. And they range from renewing assets or replacing assets in lieu of the asset age, which I would remark that most of the town's assets is relatively young to middle age. There's some older assets for sure. So you're in a good position at this point to start managing your assets. Asset maintenance is always important, and balancing that with capital rehabilitation. Operational efficiency and sustainability, those are two important themes that have been identified in the corporate strategic initiatives. And then, of course, service level improvement. There's a definite perception that the public is expecting more out of assets as time goes on. And, of course, there's also that pressure to not increase taxes to pay for higher levels of services. So we have to find ways to balance that off. And then regulations and compliance is always an important topic in municipal services because it is a highly regulated industry. And the knowledge of assets, understanding our assets and how they perform. That's important for the town as well as for all of municipalities. Next, we look at best practices, because this is where we're going to compare current practice against something. And these are a list of current best practices in asset management. There's a much longer list, but these are the primary ones. ISO 55000, which is really based on PAS 55. So now we have an international standard for the practice of asset management that was built upon some more practical aspects in PAS 55, which came out of the International Infrastructure Management Manual. I think it was originally published in 2002 in New Zealand. So we have a good encyclopedia, if you will, of practices to do our comparison against. And typically that's done through a maturity assessment. And it's the process of measuring for asset management capability against these standards. And it's a tool to help us understand the gaps in our current practice. And the way that it works, this is an illustration on the upper part of the slide. We have asset management areas. Within those areas, we have a number of different elements. And then for each element, we have a number of questions. And the example that we have below is the area of performance and demand, or performance and demand management of assets. We have levels of service and asset demand. And under levels of service, we have the question, have the levels of service been identified and the link between performance, risk, and cost been established? So we answer that question in the context of the town's services. So we do it for each of roads, for each asset sector, roads, water, wastewater, facilities, fleet, et cetera. And then each question, or rather each answer is rolled up to an overall score for the town. And our comparison frame is 5 levels, starting from basic or aware to the top end 5, which is optimizing and excelling. Level 4 is generally regarded as having achieved the standard. So whether it's ISO or whether it's PAS 55, if you're at level 4, you've achieved fully the standard. And then level 5 is, room for continuous improvement. And in the example on this slide, we have for AM structure, that's really around governance, is there an established, including defined roles and responsibilities, appointing an AM manager, et cetera. And then and this is just a shortened version of the state for each of the 5 levels of asset management. But if you have no defined AM roles or support, you'd be a level 1. You have some responsibilities defined, you'd be a level 2. Moving all the way up to level 5, you've got the asset management functions included and supported at all levels and positions. And that would include at council level. So that's how you apply the framework against each element in each area of asset management, and you answer each of these questions of each sector within the town. And then we come back to our asset management vision again, because what this is going to set out for us is our end goal. So we know that we're going to be somewhere between a level 1 and a level 5 right now, and we want to know where would we like to be in the future. And looking at this vision, it's quite encompassing, quite large, and we would speculate that it really represents a high level of maturity of practice of asset management. So definitely achieving competence or the current asset management standards. Okay, so we know that's where we would like to be ultimately. Whether that's 1, 2, or 10 years down the road, we have our target. Now we have to look at our current practice and figure out how we're going to move towards that target based on where we are today. So the other thing that we wanted to look at also is the state of practice and make a comparison with the town itself, because while we can look at best practice, we have to understand whether contextually it makes sense for the town of Newmarket. If within, let's say, Ontario, within York Region, if that level of practice is far and above everyone else or far below everyone else, then that's important to know. So if we look at across North America, Canada, and the US, according to this research by McGraw-Hill, we find that there's barriers to asset management which we've linked up with drivers. And the barriers are the complexity, effort, and cost of implementation, lack of adequate data for rigorous analysis and planning, and difficulty in developing useful service level measures and targets. So what this is really saying is here's our top 3 barriers and top 3 drivers, or matching drivers to those barriers. And if we look at that, we find that it's quite similar for the town of Newmarket, as well as most of the other towns or local municipalities within York Region, and indeed within Ontario. So when we look at it from this perspective, we say, well, the town seems to be much like most other municipalities in Ontario, and indeed in the United States and Canada. You have these same issues. So after we've applied the number of questions against all the different asset sectors, we summarize what we find, and what we find is that the town is at an early state of maturity of asset management practice. Many of the asset life cycle processes are in place, and not untypically, the capital planning process and integration, especially for a local municipality, is quite well developed. So that's pretty common. So we're saying you're much like most of the other municipalities in Ontario, and also if we compare with the York Region's local municipalities, you're much like them. So life cycle process in place, but not fully developed, not fully documented, and they're not applied consistently throughout the asset life cycle or across the asset portfolio. So some assets, such as roads, water, wastewater, they're more advanced than other assets, let's say supporting assets like fleet, buildings to an extent, and IT. So as a snapshot of maturity assessment, currently the town is at about a level 2. The level anticipated by the asset management vision, as we said, is a level 4. And so we've said, well, a reasonable target for improvement in the next 5 years is probably somewhere firmly in a level 3. Okay, so we understand the current state, we understand where we'd like to go in the long term, and we think to go from a 2 to a 4, it would be a lot more work, and it's preferable to do it in a stepwise fashion. So go from a level 2 to a level 3. 5 years is probably a reasonable period of time within which to do that. And this provides the spider chart of a composite result for the town. So the average of roads, water, wastewater, IT, fleet, etc., in each of the asset management element areas. So you can see in the light blue circle, that's achieving the ISO standard. In certain areas, you're getting quite close. In other areas, you still have a lot of room for improvement. And our next step is the gap analysis. So we understand the current state quite well. We understand we need to make an improvement to about a level 3. And by depicting it like this is our Excel spreadsheet tool, we're able to easily visualize the gap. So for each asset management assessment element, we can see what the current score is and have an idea that we want to be somewhere in the range of 3 developing. So if we look at the bottom, we have data sharing and information quality. You're at a level 1, so we see what the gap is. It's easy to visualize and understand. And the next thing we do is understand how to fill that gap. So what's the need assessment? So for asset demand, the gap is that it's not formally captured for many assets. Okay, so we have an asset management element, we have a need assessment, and the next step is to evaluate strengths and opportunities as an overall for each area. So the next couple of slides speak to that. Within strategy and planning, the town is well positioned since they have completed asset management plans for roads, for the major assets, and also has an asset management policy. So, and I would also say that the asset management strategy that you've currently got in draft form is also an important step in this particular area. Performance and demand, and again, we have to note that this is fairly typical across Ontario. Within the asset management plan, there's performance indicators have been indicated, but we don't have a good strong link between the service that's delivered and the performance indicators that we've developed. And so we want to strengthen that over time. Organization and people, especially for smaller municipalities, and I would conjecture that the town of Newmarket is kind of at the cusp of not being small, but not exactly being large. You have to be able to, obviously, as a municipality, afford dedicated roles, and there's a size factor that comes into play. And we would suggest that the town is at that point where they're large enough to have some dedicated roles for asset management. And like most municipalities in Ontario, currently the town does not have dedicated roles, but relies rather on technical staff within the various departments to deliver asset management. There is the Asset Management Committee that helps oversee this, but it makes it more difficult to pull it together in a consolidated fashion when it's distributed like that across the different departments. Our life cycle practices we summarized in our overview, that they're mostly in place but not fully developed and not certainly across all of the town's assets. And then the asset data and information, there is a system in place currently, J.D. Edwards, which works very well as a financial system and register for FIR or PSAB, but not particularly well for asset management. We want a little more granular detail in order to perform asset management. Monitoring improvement, we don't have a standard framework for measuring the condition of assets, and that's useful when you want to start making cross-sector comparisons and setting cross-sector targets, and obviously portfolio optimization as well. Risk management hasn't been formally applied across the different assets within a standardized framework of measurement of risk. In other words, what are our consequence factors if an asset fails, and then how each individual asset compares within that framework. And decision-making, I mentioned already, there's very good practice for capital planning and integration, but what's required is a process coordinated and fully developed to bring some of that advanced decision-making, the analytics into play, enable the cross-sector comparison. That, having a risk framework and standardized condition is also going to help you in that particular area. And finance, I think the town's in a very good position, having completed a recent capital financing strategy. We think that it will be much improved once asset management data is in a better form in the future. And then lastly, for data management, again, this is very typical, generally regarded as one of the most important areas, and generally is usually one of the least mature in any municipal organization. And that's having formal documented processes for identifying data standards, et cetera. So we understand the gap from an overview perspective, and we want to fill that gap. We've identified for each need assessment, each asset management element, a project required to fill the gap. So we've identified 31 initiatives in total. And what we tried to do is balance off. It's quite easy to turn this list of projects into hundreds, but we want to try to make something manageable and obviously highlight what we feel is the most important over the 5-year period. So this list is a partial list just to give you something a little more legible about the types of things that we've identified. And obviously right at the top of the list would be to adopt the integrated asset management strategy, which is the draft report that's currently been prepared. There's also another one, third down the list, which is develop the asset management plan for missing asset classes. This is already on the radar of the town staff because it's a necessary requirement for some provincial funding.
Can you just give a quick example of a missing asset class?
Yes, so fleet, as a for instance. So currently, as I understand it, in asset management plans are required for all assets listed in FIR. So that's the Financial Information Return Schedule 51. And that would include pretty much all your assets except those that you use internally, like your own IT assets. However, having said that, we would also offer up that it's probably not a bad idea to include those assets anyways. So a missing asset would be a fleet, facilities, I believe, as well. Some of the parks ones as well. Asset management plans have not been completed. Okay. Lisa can correct me if I'm mistaken. Okay, so that's what's missing. The major ones were done first because that was part of the original funding requirement by the province. Do major assets first, and now they're following it up and saying, okay, that's great, but now also include some other assets. They're also asking for a little bit more rigor in the actual asset management plan itself. So the next thing we want to look at is, okay, if we do all of these projects, where are we going to end up? Because the goal was to end up in a condition state of 3, which is a score of 60 or better. Currently, you're at a score of 45, which is midpoint, about state of maturity level 2. If you do all of these projects, overall, you see the bottom line score. In the future, you're going to end up with a score of 62. So numerically, that's where you'll end up. And in terms of state of practice, you'll be at a level of 3. Some things will be a little bit more, as you can see, and some things a little bit less, but they'll all be at a level 3. And that's the goal for the 5-year plan. Now, that's if we do them all at the same time, which obviously we can't do, so now we have to figure out what's a good order and sequence, and so we set priorities based on the importance of an asset management element, the link between the town's drivers and those asset management elements, and some natural logic, if you will. Some things have to be done before the other, like left foot first, then right foot, et cetera. So for all of the projects, each one has been defined with a number that corresponds to the asset management elements. So 140 would be strategy and planning, and the -1 indicates that it's a rank of 1. So there currently is still some issue with where exactly stormwater assets belong in terms of departmental responsibilities. Right now it's kind of split, which is fine, but from an asset management perspective, we want to be a little bit more clear. If it's going to be split, exactly who's responsible for what portion of the management of the assets, operations, maintenance, and let's say life cycle management or long-term asset management. And then if we look at the summary of the project requirements, we have a total duration of 87 months. So that's if we strung them one after another without any overlap. We have an estimate for each project of the amount of management time, technical staff time, and stakeholders. So stakeholders would be frontline staff. It could be other department managers, let's say the roads manager versus the water wastewater manager. And the technical staff would be those folks involved with the technical aspects of, let's say, measuring condition or determining capital requirements. And then there's also an external cost, which the town staff costs are not included, of about $1 million. So if we did that over 87 months, that's what it would look like in terms of averages. Obviously 87 months, 3% of management time, technical staff time, 28%, et cetera. So we've shortened that to 60 months, which we think is a good period for a plan. And it's still, while it's making the technical staff requirement higher, it's still, we think, reasonable, given that many of these activities are not something entirely brand new, but rather an enhancement or improvement on things that are already done. So on average, it works out to about $212,000 per year, and that percentage of staff time. So the next part is, when we lay this out, is to understand some themes for implementing it. And what the themes help us is to give us some focus over the period of 5 years, because rather than just a string of projects that result in a score of 62 from a score of 45, we have some themes such as governance, which is building the town-wide asset management framework, such as risk and levels of service, and more importantly, the organizational capacity. So that's asset management staff, skills training, et cetera. And then capital program decision-making, those things that contribute to capital, our capital plan. We want to, here's where we can get some real examples, such as in the case for asset management example, of return on investment for our asset management program. The other themes are data information and maintenance management. And then finally, over the latter part of the 5 years, optimizing those practices that we've started to improve and making them even better. So if we look at the resource requirements, I want to focus here for a moment. We said it's an average of about $200,000 per year for each of 5 years. We have recommended several new positions, an asset management manager, some technical staff, and some IT staff. And then we look at what available resources there are for the town. There's an OSIF grant for eligible asset management activities, which does include a lot of these asset management programs, including some staff time or salaries. And so the total OSIF grant is about $318,000 per year. That's what the town currently has. And the town also has one vacant position for asset management coordinator, not asset management manager. So we compare what we're recommending for a 5-year period with what you have in hand. And then to discuss a little bit more detail, the recommended positions. So asset manager, we're saying immediate being 2017, which is the starting point for the overall strategy. And that's to oversee and provide direction to the town for asset management practices as a whole, and very specifically would also act as the project manager for these 31 initiatives. So there is time and effort involved, irrespective of the asset management program, in actually delivering these projects. And then the technical staff, which we're saying, well, in 2018, which coincides, as you'll see in a moment, with the CMMS, Computerized Maintenance Management System. Coinciding with that software is some technical staff to help collect the data required for the CMMS and manage that data. And that's where the IT staff come in as well. With a new computer system, or software, I should say, you're going to need technical staff, IT staff, to help support it. Now, how you actually go about implementing these staff, because it's going to be spread across different departments, is going to be somewhat complex, but that's where the asset manager position can help over the preceding years to help identify a good way of implementing, let's say, part-time responsibilities that result in full-time positions across a number of different asset sectors. And the schedule details by program theme in this table. Governance, project costs of about $140,000. Starting in January 9th, 2017, we need to, it's a Microsoft project schedule, so we need a start date. We arbitrarily selected that one, and ending in 2017. So you get in this table a snapshot of, within each theme, the total cost and the total duration. And there is some overlap, which is shown pictorially in this slide. So you see over that period of time, 2017 to 2021, which theme is being undertaken, and overall where the new resources come into play. In 2017, the asset manager. In 2018-19, the technologists and IT support, and then the project costs, which excludes staffing costs. Okay. And then we look at some success factors. I should also comment with respect to the resource requirements. These are estimates, and the town has the flexibility to either engage new staff to help support the program as it's developed and moves forward, or to do some outsourcing. But we caution that outsourcing has some limitations. And typically, if you're going to outsource, you're going to pay you're going to pay higher for outsourcing than for your own staff. And the other thing with outsourcing is that since these requirements are ongoing and not project-based, outsourcing would enable you to accomplish the initial requirements, but not the ongoing requirement for these asset management practices, life cycle practices. So finally, coming to the success factors, and these are projects, 31 individual initiatives, and overall, as a program, it's got to be managed. And you need to have if you want to be successful, you need to have a project manager for the whole program, for these 31 initiatives. We've already identified that we think you should have an asset manager position as well. You need the leadership, obviously, from senior management and council to be endorsing this as a program. Regular communications about where you are in the overall process. And you need to invest in the staff, improving their knowledge and skills in delivering asset management practices. And of course, there is some element of change in the current practice. You're doing things in a certain way, you're going to do things in a different way. We always have to be mindful of managing change in the change management process. Okay. And that concludes the presentation.
I get some sense of what either your kids or your grandkids go through when there's a parent-teacher night and we're reviewing the report card. So this has been very informative and helpful. Any questions, Regional Councillor?
Thanks very much. Yeah, the other thought I had was that I feel like I was just involuntarily enrolled in like a mental triathlon, because I got to tell you, that wasn't easy to absorb. So I'm sure we'll have to go over it again and ask some questions, but it was very thorough. It really is very clear where each step is sort of addressing different areas. So I guess, I mean, my questions for clarification are mostly around the sort of the punchline, but what the resource requirements, that slide, that 35. So we heard a figure at the beginning of $1 million and 200,000 a year over 5 years. That's the same $1 million, and several new positions.
Yes.
Are those new positions embedded within that 200? If I read it correctly, that's accounted for in the 200,000 per year on average?
No, it is not.
That's on top of that.
That would be on top, correct.
Okay. So the schedule details by program theme page is not talking to staffing, that's only talking to the
External costs, yes.
external costs, okay.
Well, I would comment on the external costs. There's, each project initiative has been costed as if delivered externally, depending on there's other priorities besides just this asset management within the town. There's certain limits on the town staff's time, but there is some flexibility in spending more staff time and less external dollars. There's a certain amount of flexibility. In some cases, you definitely want to go external because you want to bring in that outside expertise. But in some cases, you can do things internally.
Okay, and on the same slide, you referred to the OCIF grant. It's grant funding for eligible asset management activities, $318,000 a year, and you said, I think twice, town currently has this, or what you have in hand.
Correct.
So that says slash per year. So what's how many years?
How many years is the funding available?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll hand it over to Mike.
Mike?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, there's two components to the OCIF grant. There's the one where you do application on a project-by-project basis, and there's also what they call the formula-based aspect of it as well. And that's the one that's giving us approximately $300,000 a year. Think of it almost in terms like the gas tax. It's an annual allocation. We're hoping it will be indexed as well. And on an annual basis, you just say what projects you're going to use it for, but you will be getting that we will be getting that allocation. And one of the things that's really nice about it, it does also allow for the development of asset management plans and strategies. So those funds would be available. So we don't have to apply for them. We just have to submit this is how we're spending them.
Okay, and from what you just said, at least at this point, there's no indication from the government that there's an end date to that year-over-year funding.
Correct.
So,
You never know, though.
so am I then fair to say if we've got an average of $200,000 in costs plus staffing, which looks like it could be, depending on the year, $150,000, is this $318,000 still all available and dedicated to be applied to that, or where do we stand in terms of what this could
Mr.
cost
Mace?
or would?
Go ahead, Mr. Mace.
Am I on? We would attempt to be aggressive as possible with the use of the grant. I'm going to have to look into it a little further as to what, because there's a fine line between the creation of asset management strategy and the ongoing continuation of the program itself. That is something we could provide you further information on as to what, but we would hope that we would be able to apply the full amount of the grant to net against those costs.
Okay, so am I correct then? I'm sorry, just being this blunt, but I mean, I know it's about more than this, but I'm sure I'm speaking for the rest of council when we immediately start to go, okay, so what's the impact? What's this going to cost us? How can we fund it, et cetera? I mean, it's great work and it seems very compelling and necessary. But am I correct then that if we hopefully can apply the full amount, and I'm seeing 200,000 plus perhaps another 100,000 per year in staffing, that we're very close to having the cost covered by the grants? Is that a fair statement, or am I misreading this?
That's a fair statement.
Mr. Mays?
That's a fair statement. Okay.
Could the balance be ARF funded because this is asset replacement? Is there some allocation that's a consideration?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think that, the OSIF grant funding is intended to be used to help municipalities offset the infrastructure funding related costs that they have. And it's fair to say that, infrastructure asset management is very high on the list of priorities to help municipalities optimize and prioritize their user resources. So it's our understanding that OSIF grant funding is primarily intended to support asset management, not only development, but ongoing maintenance of the activities related to asset management. And as the Treasurer indicated, we will confirm that, but that is our current understanding. As you get into the actual projects and the capital program, I think that's where you can start to draw on the asset replacement fund to actually achieve the capital program. But in setting up the plan, the strategy, and how you go about prioritizing the capital program, that's all about asset management.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, just one or two more. And am I correct in stating that the OSIF grant, if we don't, that it can only be, that it's dedicated to this type of work, and so that if we decided to do not or little of this, that money would go generally unaccessed, and we couldn't access it for sort of like work, or you see what I'm saying?
In addition to its use, the OSIF grant being used for asset management, it has some other capital programs it could be used for. The one we're currently using it for is road resurfacing.
Oh.
But it's not as extensive as the gas tax, and obviously it's not as substantial as the gas tax, but there are some other types of projects it can be used for.
Can be, okay. And so let's say as we start to roll this out, if we dedicate this entirely to this, will that create a shortfall in our road resurfacing, or something that has to be then a tax impact, or a?
Mr. Mays?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Our original intent when we went for the OSIF grant, the formula-based, we presented a report to council on that, is that we were going to use it for asset management. We did not get it to that place, nor are we allowed to accumulate those funds for a project coming down the road. They have to be spent in the year in which they're earned, and that is actually the only reason we're using it for road resurfacing, so we don't just lose those funds. So in that sense, we would not lose anything if we applied this 100% to the asset management strategy and development of plans, because in essence, we're using it for other things now as a bonus just to use the money.
Okay, and then I think the last question I have, and I guess I'm not, and I hope it's not taken the wrong way, and I don't want to necessarily imply anything, but I'm just asking a very simple question, which is that you're recommending new positions.
Correct.
Did your analysis include an analysis of the level to which any or all of this work could be handled by our current staff and current staffing, the capacity within the organization, or is this just typically, like you would say, to execute the work, you would need these new staff members, you should now do the work to decide how you achieve that?
Yeah, it's more the former than the latter. So there is some level of analysis that's gone into the recommendations. So specifically with respect to the asset manager position, the ability to do this for the town as a whole would require a significant amount of time. Simply in developing the program, there's probably about 50% of a person's time for a year. And so that level of time is simply not available from your current management staff for any of the particular asset sectors. So that one is quite easy. The other ones are a little more difficult, and the level of analysis is relatively high, like a high-level analysis, not a detailed tally up all of the activities of all of the different staff, but some level of analysis to suggest that currently you're working at capacity or close to capacity, and these additional requirements for full asset management lifecycle practices will be above and beyond your current responsibilities and duties. And specifically to the new software, CMMS, that's where the bulk of the time requirement will show itself or manifest itself. So the asset management software, to use a perhaps oversimplified analogy, would be like purchasing a bus. You have to have also a bus driver to drive that bus. So the software itself is quite complex. It has to be loaded up with data from the town's asset and has to be kept up to date. And all of your processes have to be embedded within that software in order to get the most out of it.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I mean,
Yeah.
to use your analogy, Company X might have 100 bus drivers, and 20 of them, are doing runs that only, there might be some capacity within the organization. And but you're saying you actually delved into our IT department and tried to assess the capacity level there?
Yeah, at a high level, yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Guapis?
Just had a clarification question regarding, you mentioned the software. I wanted to have a comfort level on the proprietary software that you're using. How proprietary is it? Is it open to be integrated with other software that we have in place in order to work together with, let's just say, our GIS software if it needs to be?
Yeah, so we haven't made a recommendation for a particular brand or make of software, just generically a computerized maintenance management system. And there's quite a competitive marketplace for that type of software. And over the first year of the plan, what we would expect to see happen, or the first year and a half, is that the town would work on the collection of data and practices, outlining the practices, and defining better their needs for that particular software. And one of the requirements would obviously be integration with J.D. Edwards, which is going to remain, as we understand, the town's financial system. So that was a long-winded way of saying whatever software you do select, it should integrate with your existing systems, including GIS and your financial system.
So in other words, you're not locked in with any software at this moment. It will be an actual decision by town and yourselves.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Bazans?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dean. Just a few questions related to the project management, because you indicated project management is one of the key success factors.
Yes.
And project management skills are sometimes different than the technical skills required to actually implement best practices, because you need to orchestrate and steer everybody in the right direction and make sure that all of the component parts are being done and so forth. But did you envision that the asset manager position would also be doing the project management, or is that sort of another component that would have to be factored in?
No, I would definitely envision that the asset manager position would be the project manager. Should the town act on that recommendation, then it would be natural that that position would assume the project management of the overall development of the program.
And then once all of the 30 some odd elements are in place, that person then would just carry on to manage the assets.
Correct. And
So-
if we remember that the 5-year plan will bring you somewhere to a maturity level of 3, and overall we had a vision of achieving a level of a maturity of 4. So after the 5 years, undoubtedly there'll be room for continuous improvement and further development and further projects.
So one would assume we'd ultimately like to move from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 in post the 5-year, getting us to a 3.
Correct.
Yeah,
So
okay.
certainly for the foreseeable future, there's going to be a demand for that type of position within the town. And 10, 15, 20 years from now, we could only conjecture what the environment might look like and what the need would be for that position. I would imagine there'd still be some level of need but maybe there'll be other new areas of development that that position could focus on besides just asset management.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple more questions. So having said that, and that the focus of what you're recommending is getting us to a 3, can you give us some examples of other jurisdictions that are already at a 4 or a 5?
I can tell you some organizations that are at a high level. At a 5, I'm not sure. At a 4, the organizations would be something like Network Rail in Australia. The city of Calgary, I do not think is at a level 4. They're probably a high level 3. York Region itself is probably firmly in a level 3. The city of Vaughan is probably firmly in a level 3.
So it's not unreasonable to aim for a level 3, but probably puts us in the sort of ballpark of some other leading best practices.
I would
So
say
far.
yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my final question relates to the influences on Newmarket and the different asset management drivers.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about customer service or customer expectations with the belief that the public is increasingly demanding higher levels of service, but that there's a lack of full understanding of customer expectations limiting the ability to increase customer satisfaction. So what are some of the things that would be involved in better understanding what the expectations are and customer to lead to that level of customer satisfaction? Because we talk a lot around the table about how we can improve customer service levels and customer satisfaction, but sometimes what we hear on the street and sort of what surveys tell us, there's a gap in that, and so I think that's certainly a key driver, an area for me to better understand, what's the gap between expectation and what the satisfaction levels are telling us, because our levels generally are pretty high in our surveys and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, the levels of service question is quite complex, and there is really very few organizations that have done a thorough job of connecting something that staff can measure technically to something that the customer experiences. So the level of service as a practice is about translating the performance of the asset into an experience that the customer receives. So easy ones are roads and somewhat buildings, because the customer can directly experience the road visually as well as from a ride perspective. So we can create technical expectations of what we want the asset to do in terms of rideability into something that the customer experiences. So that's quite straightforward. Where it gets more difficult is for something like water and wastewater, where undoubtedly we expect that the water quality is going to achieve the regulated requirements. And the York Region's water and the town of Newmarket's water achieves those regulatory requirements. Then there's some aspects around taste and odor that might occasionally occur. Again, something that you can address. It's a little more difficult for what technical thing you could adjust to affect taste and odor, but there are some things. And then the other one around, more specifically around asset performance, would be the number of breaks. So how are we going to translate the number of breaks in a water main that we're willing to put up with in terms of what the customer experiences? And typically you try to create some cost connections between what it costs to repair a break, and that's relatively straightforward to measure because we send our crews out, they put a collar on the brake, and we're back in service. So we can measure the cost of that. What's more difficult to measure is the social cost, the cost of diverting traffic or inaccessible storefront or something like that because of a break. So those are the sorts of issues that you deal with when you talk about service levels, and what we want to try to do is create those connections between, we can very easily say, well, we'll fix brakes within 4 hours of it occurring. That's an easy target, but in terms of a broader perspective, how that affects the customers, it's a little more difficult to measure. Okay, and you can't actually figure out the future performance without some kind of predictive analysis. So we know the number of brakes now. Statistically, based on a number of parameters, we can predict what the number of brakes might be in the future. I don't know if I directly got to your question.
That's very good. I think it's very important because often, even in our, budget planning process, we have to pay attention to those things that are maybe underground or aren't as visible, but do have other connected costs to them. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like the difference I often say between replacing your roof. Well, you have to do it, but I'd much rather take that money and upgrade my kitchen because I can see it and I'm, in it every day, as opposed to looking up on the roof. But it's challenging sometimes when we're making decisions between, the things that you have to invest in and the things that people will actually physically, tangibly experience every day. So, so I think that is a key component of looking at an asset management plan that takes care of those things. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Twining?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It is quite in-depth, and I kind of got lost in a few little spots, but one page I did really want to go over again that I wasn't too sure of was slide 37 with regards to the project costs. And you've got a project theme with different areas and time frames of when it starts and ends. And I was having trouble really wrapping my head around what all of that really means, and what do you mean by when you say the project costs? Is that including the staff, or if it's outside of staff? And you may have answered that already, but if you could just go over that again for me, I would appreciate it.
So if we look at the table on slide 37, what it outlines is how within each of these themes the $1 million, we'll just call it $1 million, is spent within each theme and over what period of time. So that is only external costs and does not include the staff costs. And then within each theme, there's a number of different projects as well. So if we go back up to this slide on number 30, you'll see some of the projects all of the projects within the governance area and some of the projects within the capital program decision-making area. So that's year one. That's how year one costs are made up. So there's $140,000 for governance projects and a partial amount of the capital programming costs.
So when they say, so can you give me an example of what you mean by those costs? What are they? Like, is it the software? Is it the, what?
Well, if we took the software as an example, it would include not only the cost of, let's say it's $240,000 for the asset management software. There's also a cost to configure that software to the town's needs, and then there's a cost to implement that. Okay, so there would be 3 separate costs: the actual product, and then let's say a consulting time, if you will. It would undoubtedly come from the software vendor, but it would be consulting time for a number of different activities. And then on top of that, for the software, what you'd have is that software has to, depending on whether, there's a whole series of questions to answer, but if it's going to be on the town system, then there's a cost of the town staff to say, okay, we have to get our system ready to house this software, and then we have to support it. And that's things that town staff actually have to do. That's not part of those external costs.
Okay.
Okay. So for the most part, the costs are, I would call them soft costs, so they're consulting costs or vendor costs, and not actual material things.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then going to the part with regards to an asset management position, that's obviously an integral part of this whole presentation, and if we move forward in this direction of our asset management plan. Is this a position that is someone that is, I guess, qualified in this area? Is there a specific, qualifications that like in training and people out there in this field? Is it something that's common out there? Or?
Well, with respect to, I'll answer the question in two parts. The first would be with respect to the training, and the second about is it common. So, say 6 to 10 years ago, asset management as a practice was emerging. There was some firm ideas around how it should be done, but no curriculum, if you will, around developing the skills for it. So it was asset management as a practice it's not something that's brand new, since we've, as humanity, have had assets, since the dawn of time, if you will. We've always managed them. What's different about it is to do it in a sort of structured or organized fashion. So more recently, there certainly is a lot of curriculum available. You can become a certified asset manager through IAM, which is a UK association, International Asset Management Association. There's also courses offered by OGRA, Ontario Good Roads Association. They have a certificate program for asset management. And there's also a number of universities and colleges that are offering courses in asset management. And it's really built around either ISO 55000 or PAS 55, around the practices embedded in there. Okay, so yes, it's a definite skill set, but it's still relatively new and emerging. So, there's, let's say, not thousands of people that have achieved it, but there's certainly a number, and it's growing. And then the second part is it common, a common position? And I don't know if you intended it in this fashion, but the way I interpret it is, do most municipalities have a position of asset manager? And the answer would be no. Many and most do not. But the ones that are moving forward in a constructive and deliberate fashion, they definitely are. So City of Vaughan has had their position in place for somewhere around a year now. City of Calgary definitely has had it for a number of years. Region of Peel has a position for corporate asset manager. So it is becoming more commonplace to have a position like that. Let's say somewhat smaller municipalities, somewhat. The town of Ajax has an asset manager position, but as an example, the town of Aurora does not, although their public works director is quite knowledgeable in that area. I don't know to the extent that they've hired folks with asset management capabilities. So it's somewhat varied, if you will.
Right.
But once you reach a certain size, then it's definitely, you need to justify it with the size of the municipality, and I think Newmarket is kind of at that point where it could be justified.
And just to follow up with that, with regards to having a position in place like this, and it sounds like it's very emerging in the different municipalities, and maybe it's going to become more and more something that's needed. And maybe through you, Mr. Mayor, maybe Mike Mays might be able to answer this, is if we were to, I don't know what the implementation thoughts or plan were, obviously it has to be approved by council, but yes, if we are to delay this at some point, just is it going to cause any, obviously it's going to, I guess it's that future 5-year period out, whatever we delay, it may change that sort of time frame out, I guess, of where we'll be, and making sure that we, going back to those beginning slides, that our assets are, for example, roads, or, the ones that are needed to be repaired quicker or whatever are more, are done as, in that graph. It's hard to, explain it properly, but I guess, my question, I don't really have a question, kind of rambling here, but I guess just thinking about, implementation, is it critical if we, wait 2 years or 3 years, and that kind of?
Is it critical? I would say that very important that you move sooner than later, and especially if you do decide to embark on this asset management strategy. I mean, it still has to let's say, semi-formally be adopted by the town and staff. If you start to embark on some of these things, it's just going to be more difficult to embed the practices across different departments when you don't have a sort of central organizing focus for it. So you do have the Asset Management Committee, which can help provide some direction, but it's just going to make it more difficult. So overall, it would probably take longer, and there's a higher risk that it's not going to be integrated in the fashion that you wanted, that the town wanted to see as part of this overall collaborative approach.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nohammer, there's some discussion going on at the provincial level around asset management. Is there some consideration to that being regulated or prescribed or recommended? Are we aware of anything there? I mean, in terms of the province just initiating that type of directive?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, and our treasurer can add if he feels it's necessary, but there's definitely a requirement for municipalities to list a broader classification of assets and report on the condition and investment in those assets as part of the financial reporting. So yes, the province is definitely taking a stronger interest in ensuring that municipalities pay much more close attention to asset management and also the financial reporting around those assets.
Mr. Mays, do you want to add to that? Can you
Yes,
add to that?
I was going to talk to you in my presentation, but I'll preempt that a bit. Specifically, the gas tax has a requirement that you have to have an asset management plan in place for all your assets. And the regulations are you cannot receive your gas tax. Sorry, the regulation is you have to have one. They have not got to the point of saying they withhold the gas tax if you don't have one, but you can see that sort of imminent. You have to be able to show that you're making progress on your asset management plan. And I am specifically talking about asset management plan, but if you don't have an asset management strategy, your asset management plan has limited value because you need that to be able to implement your strategy. I think one thing we also have to look at is, so there's the gas tax. We're seeing it more and more on any sort of grant applications that they're asking the question, how does this fit into your asset management plan? That is, they want to know that this is an important consideration. When we go forward to do our DC background study, one of the new criteria is going to be we have to show how the new assets will fit into the asset management plan, that there is sustainability in maintaining and replacing those assets. So this is becoming a requirement in everything to do with the province. The other thing we also have to consider is, yes, there is some expense to putting all these processes in place for asset management strategy, asset management plan. But it would also bring some rationale and efficiency and perhaps a better focusing, a prioritization of our limited resources on asset management. In the example you were given, it was suggest that I'm elaborating a bit, maybe it wasn't intended, but that perhaps we're putting more money into our roads than we have to, or we're not putting them into the right roads. Having an asset management strategy is making sure we're putting the bucks where we get the most bang for them, and unless we have that strategy in place, we don't know that. So we could actually not be making the best use of our dollars right now. So is that critical? We are talking about implementation over 5 years to just get to a certain point. It is becoming critical, though, as far as going forward on any government grants.
Thank you. Councillor Kerwin?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you, Dean, for a most thoughtful presentation. I've always regarded we have asset management. It's like, it's asset management of our liabilities. Everything we have is a liability. I'll give you an example, 395 Mulock Drive. That's what you manage, correct? Not just roads, buildings too, facilities. Correct. And you can have people in the computer room who are skilled and good, and they manage it with the computers and so forth. But I have a problem. And that is, and I'm a broken record, and that is the tendering process that we have in Canada. And the lack of quality contractors who are left in Ontario. We always point to go back with regard to the corruption of the construction industry, but Ontario's worse, let me assure you. I'll give you an example of this building called 395 Mulock, which was just completed in 1999 on budget. But this building is an asset, but it's a liability, and we're tearing it up. We tore it up inside, we tore the roof off, we tore that out there. Because it was never done properly. Garbage in, garbage out. You know, when you do a project, there has to be quality of material and quality of workmanship and the quality of the person who's checking it. And I'm not absolutely convinced that we're doing all those things. I can give you 4 examples. This building, which is costing us hundreds of thousands because it was never done right. The River Rock Commons, the concrete was never put in properly. It was laid on earth, and I reported that to the commissioner at the time, and I said that it will all crack. Boy, am I dead on. It's cracked already. There must be 150 cracks in that concrete, and we're going to have to jackhammer it out and put it all back in again. The quality of Gorham Street, and I drive along it because we went for the lowest tender. The road looks shoddy, although it was just done a year ago. It's never been really finished to a quality. Shrigley Street, low tender. I go out there, it took longer 2 years, and things aren't done properly. And therefore, it just costs the municipalities more and more and more and more, because all we're doing is repairing the stuff that we're completing. It doesn't last the length of time it should. If you put a quality roof on, and I have an asset, my house, but it's also a liability. And when I do any work on that house, I have to hire the best, but I also have to check the quality of the material. At one time I didn't have to because most of the material was made in Canada, but it's no longer. It's coming offshore, like the drywall in Florida that was loaded with ash and so forth. So this money is costing us more and more because all we're doing is putting stuff in and repairing it. Until we change the tendering process and stop taking the lowest tender, then we're just managing liabilities. You can have a great program down in that IT, and those are the things that concern me because I love construction, and I'm appalled today at our constructing processes and the lack of checking. And all we have to do is when we put it in is take it out. And this building and the River Rock Commons are the prime examples, but those 2 streets I mentioned. Drive along Gorham, it doesn't, where we constructed, it was torn up twice. The contractor didn't know what he was doing. He put a great big hump one place and we had to lower it, and you almost look like you're going over a speed hump, and then you go further on and it looks like it's been striated. So I love the presentation. You have to manage your assets.
Yeah.
But the assets must be quality.
If I could build on that point, Councillor Kerwin, there doesn't seem to be a life cycle costing process available in the tender. If you take a look at the life of the asset and the maintenance on that, so what kind of progress are we making to incorporate life cycle costing into the procurement exercise? Yeah.
That's what I'm looking at, life cycle. I put a roof on my house, and I was a roofer. It lasted 25 years. The roofs they put on these houses now will last maybe 10, maybe 12 at best. Because you're using press board rather than 3/4-inch plywood, and therefore press board gets wet and it buckles. Therefore, water goes to the lowest point, and those houses will have water in them. I feel sorry for the average guy who buys a house today, because he'll be spending the rest of his money repairing it.
Mr. Nohammer?
Anyway, I've said enough. But until we change, and we haven't changed, I'm a broken record. We still get crap, and we've driven out all the best contractors. We got a few left, but not many. Barracon's gone, they were quality. But they can't bid because they don't get the tender. So I spend all my time preparing a read where I'm going to put the 3/4-inch gravel in, I'm going to put the gravel underneath the sidewalk, I'm going to put the sidewalk in, not on the earth. I watched them lay out pathway from Sheridan Court down to College Manor, right on the earth, and the weeds were coming through within. I phoned Rob Prentice, I had him come down and stop. Or they were going to put the pavement on the curling club on compost material, it would have sank.
Mr. Nohammer?
That's the problem I've got, sir.
So in terms of the advancing life cycle costing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there's some really good points there about initial quality of the asset, and and I think the asset management strategy looks at the condition of the asset as a very important piece of data. So what you would like to optimize is the initial quality of the asset. I think what, with respect to procurement, and practices with respect to, low bid or other alternative methods for procurement, that's certainly something we heard, and we'll take that back and consider. Contractor and consultant evaluations are also being undertaken now as a means of capturing poor performance on both contractors and consultants, and that information will go towards the procurement of improved contractors in the future, I'm sure. But yeah, just returning to the condition of the asset, I think that life cycle component of assets is extremely important, and starting with a very high condition rating is key as well. So thank you for those comments.
Thank you. We're giving some consideration eventually to a very significant investment. Is there any way that we can quantify the benefits of undertaking a program like this? At the region, I've heard the term infra-stretching. Is this going to enable those kinds of things where we can get some indirect benefits and higher or a longer life stream out of the existing assets? Does it lead to that, and is there any way that that can be quantified?
That's somewhat of a difficult question to answer. If we look at each asset, whatever it might be, having a defined lifespan, then no matter how much maintenance that we do on that particular asset, it can only last that defined lifespan. So in some respects, the answer is no. You can't get more out of the asset than its defined lifespan. But if we think of it as not a single unit, but a composite unit, and we'll use the simple example of a car, we can replace our car after 8 years or 250,000 kilometers. And we have a general idea that at that point in time it will be in a certain condition. We can keep it longer than 8 years and 250,000 kilometers, and provided that we collect good data, we'll be able to understand the probability that within the 9th year we'll have a breakdown of a major component like the drivetrain that we might have to replace on 10% of our fleet, as an example. So we'll have increasing maintenance costs and decreasing overall condition of that asset by keeping it longer than the intended 8 years and 250,000 kilometers. So in some respects, the answer is no. You can't get more out of something than is physically possible. But on the other hand, you can extend how long you keep something. It will not be in as good a condition. It will have a higher risk of failure, and it will have higher maintenance costs. And the whole thing about asset management is so long as we're collecting the data and understanding the costs, we'll be able to understand that if we keep it for 8 years, here's what our operating and maintenance costs are going to be, and here's what our upgrade and replacement costs are going to be. And we'll understand that if we extend it to 10 years, how that affects the total cost of ownership over the 8 or the 10-year period, and which is the optimal point.
So conversely, with all that data, we might be able to discover something that we've only kept for 6 years that we might be able to keep for 8 years.
Within an acceptable
Yeah,
level
yeah,
of
within
risk,
acceptable
yes,
level. Okay.
definitely.
Now, but
Concrete. You mix it, the concrete with sand. You put an extra bucket of sand in there and you dilute the real mix.
Yeah.
I have sidewalks outside of 69 Coleman. I have 4 properties in Toronto. The sidewalk was put in 1955. The sidewalk's as solid as can be on all of these sidewalks. And yet we can't put in sidewalks in Newmarket that'll last 8 years. Those lasted 50 years. It's because we've changed our nature. We have alloys and we have plastic, and we mix the extra bucket of sand in with the cement so it's diluted, so it corrodes, it rots. Cement will rot because it was never mixed properly. And we don't have that quality anymore. That's just me.
Yeah, no,
I've outlived my lifespan. I don't deny that. But at one time, I have furniture that's 200, 300 years old.
thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. It was, yeah, the other, thank you. You mentioned that we're too big to be small and we're too small to be big. Is there a component of this project that might have some Northern Six collaboration that would make this a little more, I mean, financially a little more viable? Have we given any consideration to anything like that, like with the other municipalities?
Through you, Mr. Mayor,
Is it-
there was an exercise, I believe it was last year, where the asset management state or status of the N6 municipalities was collected, so information was, surveyed information was collected. We can look into where that sits right now, but you know, I think the particular responsibility for looking after the assets of the town, you know, we want to indicate that that is important and it requires some dedicated resources to do that. And I guess as you provide those services across, or just in part for the town, you know, I guess we're hearing that there's a requirement to have that dedication as part of the town, at least for the manager. There may be some ability to share among N6 with some of the technical or IT system software support, and that's something that we could take back.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more person in the queue, Regional Councillor, and then maybe we'll take a break before we do the next presentation. Regional Councillor?
Thanks very much. Slide 12, just to understand, that was that example, model capital planning, that was roads, and you're looking at an approach of taking the value by condition and class from one scenario to another. That's based on actual Newmarket data?
Correct.
And so that alone implies, and that's part of what this process will do in other areas, right, is to look at things like this. And
Correct.
to the mayor's point, though, I mean, that example led to a potential increase in a need for $1 million per year over the next decade if we want to change from the one scenario to the improved scenario. So there's an equal or greater chance that the process will lead to greater capital costs and greater needs for supporting our asset management fund, for example, et cetera. Is that
I think
probably a
that's
fair
fair to say,
statement?
yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then I guess my other question is, and this might be to more staff, but so where do we go from here? Is this then going to, staff report's going to come back, lay out sort of recommendations how to move forward. I assume one of those recommendations would lead pretty quickly to the asset management planning part after the strategy, or the plan part as opposed to the strategy part. And last question, if I could, just so they can all be answered at one time, is that is it staff's intention to address some of this as part of this budget process?
Mr. Nyhammer.
Yes, thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to ask Lisa to address what happens next part of the question, as we do have intentions to bring it back to committee.
Yeah, as part of the outcome of this, obviously there's a full final asset management strategy that will be shared with council. You've received the executive summary. You should have had that on Thursday to kind of take a look and see what the basis of this presentation was. We will be bringing back a staff report in January seeking your direction and your input with respect to implementing this strategy and the implementation plan. With respect to the budget for 2017, I'm going to leave that to Mr. Mays to talk about what has been included.
Okay, over to you, Mike.
Thank you. In the budget for 2017, we have not included all the incremental costs that you have in here. As was mentioned on the staffing, there is a vacant position for asset management coordinator, so there is some money in the budget for that. There also is a provision in the capital budget for asset management software. Probably, there's still some, yeah. Off the top of my head, sorry, I don't know what the amount is. It's probably not to the level that would be required for that. So we do have some monies in the budget. The submissions we received to this point for the 2017 budget do not incorporate any of the additional funding requirements that you've seen in the presentation today. We would wait to see what happens in January as far as the asset management strategy and how that is adopted and roll out something at that time. We will be talking, though, and it'll come up a bit in the next presentation, is some of the concepts will come forward, though, in the budget.
So, sorry, just so I can clarify, because I think but did I hear, though, that much of this, obviously, especially multi-year stuff, but is not in the budget, but I thought I heard you say the position of asset management planner and some software costs are currently embedded in the budget.
Mr. Mays?
Yes, these are not new costs for 2017. These are costs that were approved in previous years. The position was, and the software was approved a couple of years ago. So that is a capital budget that is on the books that's been carried forward. There's provision. There's actually a vacancy, an FTE for asset management coordinator. So those are actually existing in the current 2016 budget. They would be the starting point for 2017. Now, what we've also identified is some additional costs here, but we'd have to see what the actual incremental impact is, because if we apply the OSIF grant towards it, there may not be any new incremental cost to be absorbed. So I guess the best thing would be we would provide that in January, come forward with the strategy to give a better picture of what the financial impact of this would be.
And is the current FTE that's been previously approved, is that being used as gapping, or is it going towards road resurfacing currently?
Any position that is not filled is automatically used as gapping. I mean, it's money that's not in the budget. However, if I recall correctly, the funding source for that position is not tax funded, so it's not impacting on our bottom line.
Okay, thank you.
So if this is part of a consideration for the budget, would we have one of those decision pages, Mike? If that was incremental?
I'm not sure what the actual format we will, but we'll provide some comprehensive estimates on what we anticipate, what is already embedded in the budget, what the incremental costs would be. We could project it probably for the 5 years of this program, and the application of the OSIF grant, what that would be.
Okay, good, thank you. All right, thank you. We don't need a motion because this is a workshop. I appreciate the effort. And it certainly is a complex issue, something we'll need to come to grips with over time, and the extent to which we can capture some early benefits, I think, is it would be important to us. So thank you for the presentation. What we'll do is take a break until about 3:30, and we'll come back and take a look at the financial sustainability presentation. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very extensive.
Okay. If I could have everyone take their chairs, please. Ideally, I'd like to target at least 5 o'clock to wrap up this section of the workshop. So I'll call on Mr. Mays to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, we're getting the presentation up. I just wanted to remind you, this is the second of two supplementary information sessions that we provided for council to provide background information for their deliberations in the 2017 budget process. Last week we focused on the operating budget. This is somewhat on the capital budget, but not specifically on the capital budget. We're going to look at the pillars of financial sustainability, which is more on a long-term basis. But these are some things you might want to take into consideration as we go through the 2017 budget process. As I go through each of the pillars, I will give a status update with some of the financial indicators and tell you about some of the fiscal policies that we're looking to implement as a result on some of them. So these are the 5 pillars of financial sustainability. You'll see I've also added 6. It's not truly a pillar, but capital budgeting. I just wanted to speak to that briefly as well. I also want to tell you the source of a lot of the information on the financial indicators we're going to provide. The primary sources are actually our financial statements, which we do on an annual basis. We also do the FIR, which you heard referred to as a FIR, which is the financial information return. That's supplementary information we provide to the provincial government, which gives additional details on items in the budget. We also prepare on an annual basis with our financial statements what we call is the FSD&A, which is financial discussion and analysis. It goes into the various factors in the budget and tries to explain them as to what's going on. Now, the FIR is very critical because it's what's used by a lot of different sources for analyzing our information, providing measures. The Minister of Municipal Affairs actually it's just Minister of Municipal Affairs now, uses the information from the FIR to prepare an annual report card. So their report card is based upon our 2015 FIR, and I'll be making some reference to that during this presentation. BMA Consulting also does an annual review, which is referenced information from the latest FIR, in this case 2015. Any information they have in fees and charges for 2016. Sorry, and the FIR is mandatory for all municipalities in the province, so all 440 have to reply. The BMA is an annual review of only participating municipalities. There's approximately 100 of them. It encompasses pretty well everyone in the GTA, and we've just received the draft for 2016, so it hasn't been finalized yet. So I'm going to include some information from that. In addition, we commissioned our internal auditor through the region to review the levels of infrastructure levy of comparable municipalities, and that's provided some interesting information. They as well have used the 2015 BMA study and 2015 financial statements to provide their information. So I'm going to be making some references to these things, and I just want to let you know ahead of time what they were. So on asset management, we just had a presentation on that. Just wanted to make sure you're clear on the update on a couple of things. So our first asset management plan was done in December of 2014. At that time, we just did the minimum requirement. So we just provided in the information on wastewater, water, roads, bridges, and culverts. These represent about 50% of our depreciable assets. The only non-depreciable tangible capital asset we have being land. We're planning an update for early in 2017, for which we'll be adding stormwater and buildings. Stormwater is appropriate because going to the new stormwater rate and buildings, and I'll get to more of that why we picked buildings. That will then bring up our coverage on the asset management plan to 80% of our depreciable assets. Again, as I mentioned previously, the requirements for asset management plans as far as the promise and grants is concerned, specifically the gas tax, is that we have to be able to show we're making progress and moving forward on that. I also made reference to the fact that when we update our DCs, we also have to take into account an asset management plan for the new growth-related asset purchases. So some of the basics on debt. The main indicator, financial indicator on debt, is what's called the ARL, which is the annual repayment limit. Excuse me. This is calculated by the province, and what it takes is our interest and principal payments on an annual basis and compares them to our own source revenues. Own source revenues are essentially all our revenues excluding any contributions from developers or grants, so the things that we have control over. It limits the amount of money you can spend on debt servicing to 25% of your own source revenues. As you can see, there's a number of restrictions on what we can use debt for, essentially used for capital. We also have been using debt as internal loans. The only restriction on using internal loans as far as borrowing from reserves is that if you borrow from your development charges, it's in the Act that you have to be able to repay that with interest. So the financial indicator, as I said, is what we're looking at here is what our total debt is, our long-term debt is as a percentage of our net tangible capital assets. And as you can see, that it's progressing to less than 10% of our tangible capital assets. And I would put forth that for any business, that is probably a fairly good rate of debt level that is that low. Just to give you some information, over this time period, we've added no new debt. In 2015, we repaid $2.7 million in principal payments, and in 2016 will be 2.9. So our debt levels continue to decrease. However, our debt levels are higher than the average of other municipalities. So though on a generic basis, I would say our debt levels are low, when we compare it to other municipalities are even lower. So we're looking at information here from the report card prepared by the Minister of Municipal Affairs, where it shows our debt level in 2015 compared to that of other comparable municipalities. However, they do say, as they say there, it's a low level of challenge. They rate anything below 5% is low, anything over 10 is high, which is interesting as the ARL actually allows for 25%. This is our projection on our debt levels going forward, our payments as a percentage of our own source revenue. The top line you see is the ARL at the 25%. The next line at 10% is our own debt policy, and the line below that is where we anticipate to be going on a forward basis. So our policy, as I said, is at 10%. Based upon that, with our current debt levels, assuming that we borrow a 20-year debentures at 5%, which should be fairly achievable, we could borrow at least another $85 million. Now, I'm not suggesting we do that, but I just want to put that in the context of what that actually means. On a go-forward basis, in 2019, we took out a debenture on the Operations Center, the new Operations Center. We'll have the option at that of either paying the $8 million or renewing it for a further 10 years. If we did repay that at that time, we'd actually see Newmarket debt-free by 2026. So some policy considerations on a go-forward basis for debt. Right now, our debt policy, it was done before we actually even started our formal process currently of doing policy, just restricts the use of debt, but it doesn't give any indication of when we should use it. This policy and some other policies we're proposing to come forward with early in 2017 for consideration by council, and we're just looking to get some feedback at this time. So what we would propose is debt only be used for new capital expenditures, expenditures that are outlined in our asset management plan, expenditures that exceed 1% tax levy, in other words, they have to be significant expenditures, expenditures that are not eligible for an internal loan. The exceptions to the above would be land purchases, which obviously would not be in our asset management plan, and council would, as always, have the ability to override that. We also want to formalize the use of internal loans, which currently is actually only in our investment policy, to bring that into our debt policy. What we're proposing is the internal loans be only used for capital that can pay for itself in 10 years, whether that be through cost savings or additional revenues. That the prime rate at the time of borrowing being used for those loans, that repayment be at the lesser of 20 years or life expectancy of the asset for which the loan is taken out. Then total reserve fund loans never exceed 50% of the total reserve fund balance. And of course, council approval will be required. Also, we want to formalize some of the information as to the form and type of debt taken out. That we maintain the debt servicing limit at 10% of our own source revenues. We think that's a good target. It fits in with what the provinces established as being a high threshold. And that we establish that repayment always be the lesser of 20 years or the life expectancy of the asset. So we don't get into the practice of, say, doing a 40-year debenture on buildings of the site of that type. But 20 years be the limit. That's it for debt. So now looking at investments. An overview on investments. As you can see, our income on investments is increasing over time. We started our policy in we established our policy in 2012 and actionized it in 2013 with the strategy where we started making investments. So just to put in perspective, in 2013, based upon these investments, we're essentially in the reserve fund, borrowings from the reserve fund. We brought $50,000 into the operating budget in 2013, $125,000 in 2014, $175,000 in each of 2015, and will be again in 2016. In addition to the investments, I just want to point out, we've also started implementing what we call a U.S. exchange policy. A lot of our purchases, or some of our significant purchases, tend to be in U.S. dollars, whether it be fire trucks or water meters that we will have coming up in the near distant future. Now, there's the various methods one could do as far as U.S. exchange. You could hedge the amounts. You could just let it fluctuate and deal with it at the time. In consultation with our bank, though, we've established a U.S. bank account. And what we do is, as soon as the budget is passed, we put that amount of U.S. dollars into the account. So, in essence, we create our own hedge fund for that. We found this to be more efficient because sometimes the purchases don't come exactly at the time we would anticipate that. So what we do is we lock in on the day that the budget is approved what that rate is. Now there's some risk, but there's risk if you just wait and let the rate float and see what's going to be at that time. But the fact is, it could be higher or lower, but we know for a fact what we're going to pay for it on that basis. We take a three-stream approach to our investments. So on this page, I'm going to talk about the first two streams, the one being the short term and the other being the medium and long term. On the first stream, short term, this is our current area that we're trying to develop. This is investing money from our operating funds, our operating bank account, which, because of fluctuations in our balances due to either seasonal or cyclical nature, and the most significant example of that is we collect money on behalf of the school board and regions. We collect their taxes every month, but we remit it on a quarterly basis. So we can make their money work for us. That is something we're looking into. This is why when we updated the investment policy, we put in a provision to be able to go to the Tier 2 banks for the short term, the investments under 6 months, so that it can facilitate that. Now, on the second tier, we really haven't been able to move much into that. we don't really have a solid cash flow on our long-term cash balances, and I'll get more into that when I talk about the reserves. But that second stream has this greatest potential for making us money on our investments. The third stream is our investments in government business enterprises. Now, we take into account the interest on the promissory note and the dividends in our budget. We take them in as general revenues. But in addition to that, we also earn on the equity, our investment, which goes up every year in Hydro. This is the undistributed profit that is being held within the Newmarket Tay Hydro that has not been distributed to the shareholders. This is money that would be realized if we were to sell at some point, but this is a true capital gain that we have. So when you look at the total amount, the return we're getting on the investment from our hydro, you can see it's quite significant. And this is hitting levels that we cannot achieve on our own because of the restrictions from the Municipal Act or basically from the Municipal Act. For instance, the interest we're collecting on the promissory note is at 5.48%. I mean, we borrow money for less than that. So but that is what's allowed by the Ontario Energy Board. Moving on to revenues.
Mike, just a clarification.
Yeah. Mike, on the, thank you, Mr. Mayor. On the dividend side, you say that on the previous slide, 11, you're saying we're getting a dividend of $1.336 million, and that goes towards the appreciation of the overall value of the asset that we're holding. Can you tell me what the evaluation we are calculating on that asset is today?
Okay, through you, Mr. Mayor. The dividend is actually per Hydro's dividend policy, which is based upon the profits that they receive on an annual basis, or they project to be receiving on an annual basis. It is, as you can see, it's somewhat proportional to the amount of the equity increase. So the equity increase is what they've maintained. The dividend, as in any business, is what they distributed. As far as what the actual evaluation of the hydro is, I can find out for you what we have it on the books. I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $54 million. I'll get you the exact number for that. But what that is actually worth on the open market, I believe, I'm not sure I have that information. I believe we've had an analysis done at some point for that, though.
So we will be receiving, I think there'll be a workshop with respect to hydro, if not a committee of the whole. So that might be some of the questions we could have there. But those dividends are actually paid to the municipality, as is the interest.
I was just going to ask that too. So yeah, so we are seeing the dividend as an actual check coming to us, and the hydro equity is just the increase in the valuation, I guess. Is that right?
You're absolutely correct. So the equity is the increase in the value of hydro after making the interest payments and the dividend payments. That's the increase in the value of hydro. The other two items, we're actually getting checks for that. That is included in our operating results. That is going towards our general revenues.
Great, thank you. I thought I heard it differently, but that's great. Thank you very much.
The next chart is just a breakout of our different sources of revenue. The key thing I wanted to point out here is two of the sources, the government transfers, which is essentially grants, and contributions from developers, which is essentially development charges and assumed assets. Those are the two general types of revenue which are not considered own source. So that's approximately 14%. So you can say our own source revenue is about 86% of our total revenues. And those ones that are not own source are essentially used for the capital program and are recognized as the expenditures are made in the capital. This next chart I showed you last week as part of the review on the user fees. So 80% of our revenues are taxes and user fees. This is where the bulk of our money comes from. As you can see, the service pricing policy has not been increasing, has not been closing the gap. We spoke about that last week, and we're looking for an update on the service pricing policy in 2017. Just want to talk briefly about property taxes and assessments. So this is a couple of the initiatives that we're looking to move into. we're starting to lead the way in some of our dealings with MPACT. We're one of the first municipalities, and this will be coming next week. We're going to have a service level agreement with them. We're one of the test cases for that. We're also testing out new tools, both by MPACT and by some vendors in the tax field, to help us in trying to protect our assessment base. And this is one of the key things we're trying to do with the proactive assessment management, is protect our assessment base, because we're having a lot more activity as far as reassessments and on the non-residential side, looking for reduction in taxes. As a result, part of the new approach that we're taking is to ensure that we're consistent and fair in all dealings with regards to taxes. We may not have been as consistent and fair, well, I think we've always been fair, but maybe not as consistent in the past as we could have. So some taxpayers may see a bit of a change in that. For the first time last year, for instance, we actually rejected some applications for vacancy rebates because they weren't completed properly or on time, or we actually did more diligence on them than we had in the past. So just to give you a heads up that this is where we're moving to protect our assessment base. Now, as far as the service pricing policy, which will come in 2017, I just listed there 4 main factors that are considered whenever we look at revenue. Now, the original service pricing policy that we have in place, it exclusively looked at cost recovery. Targets were set for various levels, at various levels for different services. One of the things we're going to be looking at in the new service pricing policy is that will not necessarily be the case. Service pricing policy is a policy for established prices, but not necessarily for generating new revenues. Now, in some cases, that will be the case where it's a statutory requirement that we go for full recovery, such as we have in water and wastewater. In some cases, we may also suggest that we continue with 100% or a percentage cost recovery, such as in the case of building permits or stormwater management. And there may be other services as well that if we want to break them off the tax base, we may consider for that. There's also some services where it makes sense to get as much cost recovery as possible, such as licensing, to ensure that's at least covering incremental costs. But one of the considerations we do cost recovery is, should it be full, partial, or just covering the incremental levels of cost. So these are some considerations that we come forward on the update on the service pricing policy. We also have to take a look at the marketplace and competitiveness. This is a big issue in recreation, where implementation of service pricing policy has put us at the top end of the scale. And we have some other areas as well where fees and charges are at the top end of the scale. But that's one of the more obvious ones. Another one we have to take in consideration is our fees related to the development process. That as we want to incentivize development, that we may want to look at having our rates competitive as well. We also have things that actually are incentives, or really they're disincentives, which could be penalties and interest that we charge in various things. We as a town have tended to put those into our budget. This is probably not best practice. For instance, late payment fees on taxes, late payment fees on invoices, things of that nature, fines and penalties in licensing. We tend to, they're in there as an incentive for a certain type of behavior. Unfortunately, when we get that behavior, it has a revenue impact. The other thing that we consider when it comes to revenue is the funding requirements. Now, this becomes quite clear when we look at things which are general revenues, such as taxes. But we also have other types of revenues, such as investments. We just spoke of that on the hydro investments. There may be other things also that we can count on as we move forward, as is hitting our funding requirements. So these are the type of revenue considerations that would be factored into the update on the service pricing policy. Okay, now we're starting to get into the meat, reserve and reserve funds. I have here the definition of a reserve fund. Basically, reserve or reserve fund is just an allocation from our surplus for use in the future. That's all it is. Unlike a business or a corporation where you'd have contributed surplus or shareholders' equity, our surplus is divided into reserves and reserve funds. The essential difference between a reserve and reserve fund is one has cash and earns interest on the cash, any other doesn't. And there's many reasons for that. Reserves will tend to be things that are temporary or short-term in nature, have operating purposes. An example of that would be rate stabilization. Reserve funds tend to be things which are either permanent or long-term in nature. Most things have a capital purpose fit into that, such as the asset replacement fund. The actual practice of dividing between reserve and reserve funds can vary by municipality. We also have this strange beast called the obligatory reserve fund, which looks in every way just like a reserve fund. Development charges is a good example of that. But under PSAP, Public Sector Accounting Board, it has to be reported as a deferred revenue, so it cannot be taken into revenue until it's earned, and this tends to be things of a capital nature. The generic term for all these things is reserve, and is used quite a bit. And when we get to actual budgeting, whether it's a reserve fund, or obligatory reserve fund, it essentially has the same impact. This graph just gives you an idea of what different types of reserves and reserve funds we have. This is from our 2015 financial statements from the FSD&A for those statements. At that time, we had about $40 million in reserves and reserve funds. They're split about 50-50 between capital and operating. The capital being the asset replacement fund and reserves and reserve funds for capital purposes, and the operating being the rest. But how do our reserve fund balances compare? So we look for an indicator. And there's many different types of indicators you can have. You can look at it as per capita or percentage of tangible capital assets. But the one we landed on is a good sort is of own source revenue. Own source revenue is a good indicator of the actual activity of the municipality. This is also the indicator used by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and by the BMA as well. So according to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, we have a low level of challenge, i.e. we have a good level of reserves. Now, to put it in context, to them, a low level of challenge is anything greater than 20%. So if your reserve funds are at least 20% of your own source revenues, they consider that a good thing. If it's lower than 10%, then you have a high level of challenge. So by their definition, we have a good level of reserves, but we're not as high as the average and the median. So our internal auditor actually did a comparison to show how we sit with the municipalities we gave them to compare us to, and that's chart 7. And I apologize for this chart not being very clear. I actually took the ones from the internal auditor from a PDF. I now have the Word versions, and I'll be replacing that, and I'll be distributing those. So on this chart, you see that reserve and reserve funds as a percentage of taxation and user fees, in essence, own source revenues. The average of the comparables, that line across, is 67%. And the town is at 50%. So we're a little below the average, but not too bad. So that's not looking too bad. But the problem is the bulk of that is all in water and wastewater. So what I did is I looked at what our, for taxes, water, and wastewater, what the reserve fund balance was as a percentage of either taxes, water, or wastewater charges. And what you'll see is the trends. We actually went into a negative balance. Our asset replacement fund, or sorry, our total reserves, tax water reserves, went into a negative balance in 2015. Now, part of that was because we also did a restatement in 2015 on our financial statements, where we took some of our reserve and reserve funds and restated them as being liabilities. Anyway, that was noted in the statements, but in actual fact, we're at negative. So this shows the trends on the water. That is mostly the reserves are in the water and wastewater. And when we pull them out, we look at the tax supported, and this is from the 2014 BMA, the table 2 as reported by internal auditor. You can see that Newmarket, our tax supported reserves and reserve funds, the percentage of own source revenue, in this case being tax revenue, is only 15%, with average of 72. And yes, there are a few that raise that average, but you can see we're lost in the group. As a result,
Okay.
the tax,
Just one clarification.
Mike, when we're looking at our reserves and our reserve funds and looking at different, I know our hydro's considered as an asset. But, you know, we have other municipalities, neighboring municipalities, and they've sold their hydro asset and taken that money in the tens of millions of dollars and placed it into the reserve funds. And I'm wondering, do municipalities or does PSAB allow for that to be considered as reported as a reserve as well? Because, you know, we're looking at this information. We have this $80 million asset that really is the same as what other municipalities have used to put in their reserve funds and sold them. So.
okay, through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll try to address a couple of things there. We could not put our ownership of hydro into a reserve fund. We couldn't do that because it's not a cash asset. We can't take whatever the value of hydro is and use that money. You're absolutely correct. When you look at some of the municipalities here at the high end, they're ones who've sold their hydro, and I definitely would not recommend us selling our hydro because you can see the amazing returns we're getting, so there'd be no point in that. However, we don't have that cash available, and not all these municipalities have sold their hydro.
Right. So I want to use, you know, I just wanted to point this out, like when we're looking at the reserve funds, and to me it looks like we're on this really, really low end based on what people have in the bank. But, you know, we have this strong asset that's giving us a benefit and a dividend and interest payments. And I don't want to point out any municipalities, but I'm going to point out Aurora, who has this reserve fund of 160%, and they sold their asset and put it into a reserve fund. And in my mind, I'm seeing that Newmarket's in a as healthy or maybe healthier position. So I really wanted to just make that point.
And Richmond Hill.
And Richmond Hill as well, who are on the high ends. So I wanted to make that point on our reserves.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. However, when we look at the water and wastewater reserves, Newmarket's right up there. We're number one. This is from the 2016 BMA study. So we have good reserves if you put them all together. We saw that we were at the 50% compared to 67%, whether they sold their hydro or not, our total reserves. The issue is that all our reserves are in water and wastewater. And I've just given a bit of a breakdown here on the reserve funds, and I think this might help the councillor with what he brought up there. So what I've done is I took our balances in some categories, what they were at, I grouped them at the end of 2015, and what we're projecting for the end of 2016. Now, what I did not just take the budget. I used the budget as a starting point because we know there's an issue with the level of drawn reserves for capital, which is not going to come into to fact. So I've estimated what the capital carryovers would be. There are some issues some items that you'll be seeing in the Q3 report. So I've adjusted for that. So the 2016 projected balance is not a large change from the 2015 balance. But what you're seeing is, again, the growing trend on the water and wastewater side, especially on the ARF, the reserve funds are growing. On the tax-supported side, it's going down. And this is where things start to become an issue. So more than sufficient, I won't say more than sufficient money on the asset replacement fund. And ultimately, this is what it comes down to reserves. It's not so much the comparables. It's, do we have enough money to do what we need to do? Yes, we do on the water and wastewater asset replacement fund. The water and wastewater rate stabilization is running just under 10% of total revenues. 5 to 10% is usually the target you look for on the rate stabilization. So yes, that appears to be sufficient. Building permits, we have a lot of money in reserves there. That represents, I believe the target we were looking at was about 2 years worth of expenses, and I believe that will be exceeding that. Now, however, when we look at the tax-supported asset replacement fund, we see it's actually in a negative balance. The actual tax-supported asset replacement fund, they have approximately $10 million in cash, and they borrowed $30 million from the rate-supported asset replacement fund. This is an issue. We do not have sufficient money in the tax-supported asset replacement fund. The tax-supported capital, we have some good extra monies there, so that can help offset that. On the tax-supported operating, we have $12.6 million. That actually is a fairly healthy balance. That represents about 20% of our tax-supported, of our tax revenue. So that's a good balance. So when I look at the reserves in total, and we have our loans as well. So when I look at our reserves in total, they're pretty good. They can pretty well do that for which they're intended. Our issue is the tax-supported asset replacement fund. So, some policy considerations for reserves and reserve funds. As I said, there's one area of concern, which is in the asset replacement fund. I'm going to get more on the asset replacement fund, but when I just look at the reserve and reserve funds, we had guidelines which were established many years ago. It's time to actually put a formal policy, and essentially it's going to be housekeeping. That we want to make sure we categorize our recategorize our reserve funds. We have some we don't really need anymore. We have some which they're actually redundant. They have different names, but they're really used for the same purpose. So we'd like to consolidate some of them, and there's some new ones that we should be creating as well. We want to define what the delegated authority is as far as putting money into reserves and taking it out in the budget process, and formalize some of the procedures, such as when we the closing of reserve funds and the consolidation. As I said, a lot of reserves could be on a temporary basis. We need to calculate, formalize the process for that. We really don't have anything that says how we do calculation of interest and the allocation of interest, so we'd like to get that into the policy, the type of investments that are allowed, and the put into the policy and reserve funds, use of funds for investments, for internal loans. So just mostly housekeeping as far as the reserves and reserve funds are concerned. Now, it's the asset replacement fund that's really the heart of our sustainability here, and this goes to the presentation we had earlier. So we created the asset replacement fund in 1998, and at that time we established it to be at 100% of what the contributions were to be for water, wastewater, and fire, and 50% of everything else, which is essentially tax supported. It was thought that to take the tax support up to 100% rate at that time would have a huge budget impact, so it wasn't done. In fact, over time, and by 2008, we did bring tax support up to 100%. So we started as leaders in the asset replacement fund. Other people have copied this idea, but we were one of the first, if not the first, to be able to do that. The problem we had, though, is that the contributions were based initially on 100% of the estimated requirement for contributions, which is kind of a complicated way of saying almost what was defined to be the depreciation expense on an annual basis. What we found out when we did the tangible capital asset exercise in 2008 is that the asset values were understated, and sometimes very grossly understated, so the defined contributions were not as high as they should have been, and that the life cycle was overstated in the case of some assets. So even though we thought we were putting away 100% of the annual contributions, they were in fact not 100% of the annual contributions. The other thing is, even at 100%, that's just keeping us equal. That's not catching us up for the fact that we hadn't made contributions prior to that. Anyhow, as of 2008, when we hit the 100%, we did not make any more significant adjustments to contributions to asset replacement fund until 2013, when we implemented the infrastructure levy. This next table, this chart was prepared by our internal auditors. It shows the growth of our reserves over time, and that's a good news story, that we see them growing. And then let's compare our contributions to comparable municipalities. Again, there are many indicators that you can use for defining what the contribution level should be. One of the ones that that we found is starting to take on some traction is reserve and reserve fund contributions. Capital reserves and reserve funds as a percentage of accumulated amortization. And the logic is that if you're running a business, as you depreciate your assets, you need to collect the money for that. You need to pay for those assets. If a municipality has been doing that, it would be putting that money into a reserve, some sort of capital reserve to replace those assets at the time they come due. To not do so means that you actually are running a deficit. Now, bear in mind, though, basing it upon the accumulated amortization, that's based upon the historic cost. And in some cases, if we're talking about assets that could be 50, 60 years old, the actual replacement cost is even more significant than that. So on this table here, you're seeing that for the comparators, the average is 9.2%. So essentially, for every dollar that has been amortized in assets, they put away 9.2 cents. And the town is 8.7 cents. Again, not too bad compared to the others. We can say whether in total it's a bad story or not, but when we compare, it's not too bad. However, the problem again is it's all on the water side, the water and wastewater side, not on the tax side. If you take the water and wastewater in 2015, the reserve funds represented 38% of the accumulated amortization. On the tax side, they represented a negative 13%. This next table, and this is the one where there actually was a typo. The slides I've given you have the correction. Is under 2012, rates supported. That number should be 116%. The original version of these slides said 162%. That was a typo.
Rate support is 100, what, Mike?
The second column, 2012, the very bottom number, the original slides handed out, that were mailed out on Friday, said 162%. The actual number is 116%.
Okay.
So for addressing the infrastructure gap, this is based upon the same sort of principle. If we're putting into reserves amount of money equal to the amortization expense, i.e. depreciation expense, then we know we're not falling behind. So if we're at 100%, we're staying level. If it's below 100%, we're falling behind. If it's over 100%, we're catching up. So the good news is that in every category, you can see we're improving. So the combined, I mean tax supported and rate supported, is improving. The tax supported is improving. The rate supported fluctuating a bit, but it's over 100%. And that's really where we want to be if we want to catch up on the past, is over 100%. So we're having some limited success in addressing the funding gap from that point of view. Now, the internal auditor also did a survey of the methodologies for funding the capital reserves. And what they found was these were the common ones. So taking from your surplus, your operating surplus, and putting that into capital reserves was one strategy that they found. It doesn't work for the town in that and our budgeting is tight. And just to put that in context, what I mean by is tight is that in our general revenues, we include supplementary property taxes, we include our interest income and our dividends. Things that in other municipalities they would not include in their budget, they would not take them into general revenues, and these are things that they would be using to create a surplus, which they would transfer into the reserves. Those items do not create a surplus for us because we've already included them in the budget. The other option, is, again, a common one, is basing your contributions upon your budget, and this is what we do. This is our approach, and we've had some success with that. The other is to, in some circumstances, is to designate a revenue source and use that money to put into your capital reserves. There was one municipality, what they did is they took 25% of any of their assessment growth and put that aside for capital replacement. This is something we could consider. We could look at putting away some of our assessment growth for the growth assets. That is one of the things I referenced last week. Our hydro income and our investments income is already included in our general revenue. One thing we might look into the future is actually phasing that down and using that extra money to put aside for capital replacement. We could also consider new sources of revenues as well. For instance, as I mentioned, we're going to have our debt repaid in 2029 if we don't take out any additional debt and if we don't renew the debt on the operations center. One strategy we could use, and I know that's a few years from now, but one strategy we could use is to take the additional tax room that has and put that into our capital reserves as well. There was also conversation last week on the Emerald Ash Borer that we're building up our tax rate over time to hit a certain level of expenditures on that. When that goes down, we could either decrease our taxes or we could use that additional room to put additional monies aside for asset replacement. Again, these are just considerations. So early in 2017, we're hoping to come forward with a policy on the asset replacement fund. This is something that was actually specific. We received a specific direction from council on this. So the idea is to establish guidelines for the creation, consolidation, closure, and management of asset replacement funds to achieve long-term financial flexibility and sustainability. So aligning the categories with asset management plan. So for instance, right now stormwater is included within the roads asset management, within the roads ARF, to break that out. So some of these are fairly common. We wanted to be able to facilitate analysis of our asset replacement funds. So we want to make it synonymous with what we have in the asset management plan. I don't see this as being any big changes in that. Now, setting targets for ARF, this is something that we're going to have to give a lot of consideration to. This will be coming out of part of the asset management strategy. What I'm suggesting, there's actually 3 levels of targets we can establish. And these could be not necessarily corporate goals, but they could also be goals on specific asset types. The one is just an initial target, which is to maintain the status quo. That is to keep the annual increase to our net new requirements for asset replacement. So this is essentially indexing and growth. We could do that to make sure we're not falling behind. An optimal level is a sustainable one where we can look at our 10-year projections, and this is what we currently do for fire. This is something that library is looking at doing. Look at what our 10-year requirements and make sure that we can meet those requirements. That would be an optimal, sustainable level. An ideal level, and this is one that you're talking, it could take decades to hit, would be having contributions equal to 100% of our amortization expense, 100% of accumulated amortization, and full asset management plan requirements. That's the nirvana. Also in the policy, we want to define the use of the asset replacement fund. There's been some discussion at council on that. We're suggesting that it should only be used for tangible capital assets as defined by PSEB, by Public Sector Accounting. This will have a side benefit also assisting with our analysis. Currently, we put some money in the asset replacement fund and we use it for other things. We use it for major repairs and maintenance. We use it for condition assessments and studies. We even use it for debt servicing. We still may want to continue with that, but we're using it from some operating purposes. It makes it a little more difficult to analyze our balances when we cloudy the waters with that. So one of the things we're suggesting is we move forward is to pull those out of the asset replacement fund and just use that specifically for the replacement of tangible capital assets. We also have, as I noted, an interfund balance of $30 million between water and wastewater and tax-supported asset replacement fund. The current projections we have show that we're not going to need substantial monies of that level for the water and wastewater reserve funds until 2040. So we have 20 to 25 years before we're going to get to that point. One of the things the policy will probably recommend is that we put in place a plan to repay that, to take that out of the tax supported and repay it back to the water and wastewater. But to do it over 20, 25 years, to do it over that time period, to make it more manageable. So it will contemplate taking that debt, putting it aside, looking at the $10 million we currently have in the asset replacement fund, the tax supported, and allocate that out to the various funds we have, probably based upon their asset levels. And then on a go-forward basis, try to stay, unless we have council permission, stay within those funding limits so that we don't incur large debt. At one point, water and wastewater is going to need those monies. And though it's 20 plus years from now, I think it's important to put a plan in place to start repaying that. Anyway, I'll have more on that when we come forward in 2017. A little bit on capital budgeting. I just want to point out the nature of our capital budgeting is making for growing capital carryovers. Now, we actually do have long-term, we have a need for long-term capital projections, as I mentioned in our investments. Without that information, I can't really figure out our cash flows if I don't know what we're going to spend on capital on an annual basis. So this is hindering us from getting some additional investment income. It also makes it difficult for us to contemplate what actually our operating budget impact is going to be from capital. And because we have these capital carryovers, significant capital carryovers, there's other capital projects that aren't done, but that money wasn't spent because the project got carried over. So the challenge is that we currently, in essence, do our budgeting on a one-year cycle for capital. Full approval is sought for the whole budget, whether it's going to be completed within that year or even within any 1 year instead of phasing it. Part of this is so that we don't, it's just been our experience. This is how we've done things, and I think it's time to make a change. So it's just been the practice. There's a fear that if you put forth a project and you don't put in the second phase of it, you might not get that phase, or it could be changed. We also have many multiple and conflicting priorities, and it's easier to put everything into the budget and then choose later what to get, rather than make that decision at budget time. So there's many reasons for that. And it's not that we don't have multi-year plans. We do have multi-year plans. We see it in fire, we see it in library, we see it in roads, but we don't have them on a formal basis, and they're not consolidated throughout the whole organization. And this is just information we got from an internal auditor, and this is I call this good practice. You can call it best practice. Different municipalities, how many years their capital budgets are, how their capital plans are. So, I mean, we're pretty unique in that for our level that we just do 1 year. As you can see, the most common numbers seem to be 5 and 10. 5, I'm supposing because it's just, relates to just a little longer than the council term. 10 years makes a lot of sense, and my recommendation would be go to 10 years because that is what we use for development charges, and that's also the minimum for asset management plans. So going forward, not for the 2017 budget, we're already in the midst of that, but from that point on, some policy considerations for the capital budget. That we do, as I said, we do already have some plans in place, multi-year plans on capital, but then we formalize them. We bring them forward to council, we consolidate them, we expand them. We have it's something we're going to need for our asset management plans anyhow. And using 2017 as a starting point, I think it's time that we start consolidating some of the different capital planning components that we have. The asset management plan will be updated in 2017, as I said, to bring on stormwater and building, covering 80% of our assets. It covers all the replacement of our assets. That really should be the starting point of any capital budget. It should be flowing from the asset management plan. We shouldn't be having two separate competing documents. The development charges are not due for update for a couple of years, but it'd be worthwhile just to bring forward at the same time early in 2017 an update of where we stand on the development charges. Again, that background study really should be the starting point for our growth budget on a go-forward basis. Combined, the asset management plan replacement and development charges growth, that represents 80 to 90% of our capital budget in any particular year. So, I mean, most of our budget should be just flowing from that information, or we're just wasting time in redundancies. I also believe that we should look at reviewing this will be early in 2017, reviewing our capital carryovers. We shouldn't be doing capital carries anymore. I'm suggesting we move to a model similar to what the region has, capital spending authority. Let's take the capital carryovers we have now, either cancel them if they're not needed, that we're just carrying budgets that we don't need, or let's assign them to a year and put them into the plan on that basis. To close off, this is the rest of the budget schedule. You're probably tired of hearing me from now. You heard me last week. At least last time I had a couple of additional speakers in for variety. You had to listen to me for about an hour now. I apologize for that. I will not be coming back for another 2 weeks, though, when I present the budget. Thank you.
Any questions? Well, there's a lot of ground that we covered, Mike. I know we're looking at some areas of reinforcing and the long-term amortization expenses and some of the suggestions that you have on page 31, where we start looking at, for example, I think it's might have been in the text, where we start looking at allocating a certain percentage of the growth to asset replacement. Those kinds of things. If I recall the presentation that we had previous to this, is when we start allocating some of these things, the base budget, unless we're prepared to look at an increase in the general tax base, the base budget gets eroded. So we need to be very careful of that, or take a look at the impact. Example would be if we started directing the hydro revenues towards asset replacement fund, then if we're relying those hydro revenues, that will need to be replaced with a general tax increase. So it'll be a balancing act, and definitely there'll need to be a considerable amount of phasing that needs to be considered. The long-term direction, I think, seems to make sense. We need to take a look at the impact of implementation and how we do that, so that it's digestible within the capacity of the community. Regional Councillor.
Thanks. I think page 12 or slide 12, it's the user fees versus taxes. Do you have data on how that breaks down in other communities? I think I saw recently in the paper that East Gwillimbury's user fees represent something more like in the 20s, 25, 22% of the revenue component. Do we have any data on that just looks at that? And
we could get that information.
Okay.
Slide 12
Yeah.
is the graph. I mean, that's, we just pull off anyone's financial statements.
Okay. And then did you say that you're going to, and it's part of which process? As part of the budget process or part of the, part of a different, I assume it's part of a different process, but you're going to be, I think I heard you say you're going to be bringing us more information, which I assume is a separate report or something, looking at specifically what is, I think, the big challenge here. I mean, there were various challenges that jumped out at me, but obviously the big one is the inter-fund imbalance. And so will you be bringing a specific report on that with options? How's that being looked at?
Early in 2017, we're already in the midst of the budget process, so I don't see it having an impact on the budget. It may be something as you go through the deliberations you might give some consideration to, but it's not my intention to disrupt the process at this point. That this would be something more for 2018, is to come forward early in 2017 with a number of policies. We owe you a donation policy. We need an update on the debt policy. Reserve fund. We actually do not. We just have guidelines. We don't actually have a formal policy of reserve funds. We've been directed to do a policy in asset replacement funds. The investment policy, we do have one in place in this strategy, and that's working pretty good. And we also owe an update on the service pricing policy.
Okay.
So we have a whole slew of policies that we're going to be bringing forward, but no intention that they'll have a direct impact on the 2017 budget.
Right, but the policies will collectively start to address the interfund balance, or will there be a specific report outline options on that alone? I guess I'm trying to figure out where and when do we get to that particular issue.
Well, in conjunction with the policy and asset replacement fund, whether it's actually part of the covering report or separate report, we would address the long-term strategy as far as addressing that imbalance.
Right, and you're talking a 20 to 25-year strategy, you're saying?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councillor Broom?
Thank you. On slide 30, Mike, you, regarding number 3, you mentioned some ideas around designation of a revenue source, and you rhymed off a whole slew of what sounded like some very interesting ideas. Will we have that given to us more broken down or more in depth at some point? You said when the Emerald Ash Borough ends, we could redirect that money and so on slide 30. Designating a revenue source. You gave us some examples. I'm just wondering if at some point we could have that, listed a little bit more in depth with some of those ideas that you rhymed off there.
Yes, absolutely. I rhymed off all those other policies, and one of the other policies I'm going to be bringing forth is a budget policy, and it will recommend, for instance, a use of the assessment growth, which as the mayor stated, anything like that where we start doing phasing, but we do have a number of years we can do these over, will have a budget impact. So we want to try to minimize that, but we want to move towards what is an appropriate and sustainable use of our funds. So as part of that budget policy, we will look at some of those. Also, as part of the report that the regional councillor was asking on the managing the infrastructure gap and the interfund gap, we'd look at that as well. I'm sorry,
my question was designating a revenue source.
Okay.
I think you covered that.
Yeah, the ones I suggested we could look at is, see, in fact, when we started getting the hydro dividends, at that time, there was a statement that we were going to use 25% of that for the capital program. But in fact, we have been putting it all into the general funds, into the operating budget. I will propose, if it's not as one of those reports, it's something we can look for in the 2018 budget to start a phasing program on some of these. But also, I mentioned some things that will be built into the budget that as they come out of the budget, whether it be the Emerald Ash Borer on a go-forward basis, whether it be the retirement of debt, these are also opportunities that we can change those funding sources to use that for asset replacement as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Regional Councillor?
Thanks. Sorry, I just remember one other question I had, Mike, on slide 9. I got a little confused here, and I don't know if you could help me, but this was the investment income increase, and it went from 59,000 to 221 on the chart, which seemed like I was having a hard time imagining how we could possibly see an increase that big. But then you were saying numbers. Sorry, so it's, yes, slide 9. But you were saying numbers that were very different than what the chart said, and so I assumed you were referring to something else, but I didn't know what you were referring to, because you were saying like 125, 175.
The numbers you're seeing there on the slide are the actual incremental earnings going to investments. So we had established a threshold being the rate the bank is paying us on the money just sitting in the bank account. So, I mean, one could say it's a low threshold, but that's how we start as a threshold. So that is the amount that we earned in addition to what if we had just let the money sit in the bank account. Now, that money then, some of it goes to reserve fund and some of it went to the operating account as well, because of what we established in the policy. So the numbers I mentioned was for 2013, it was 50,000. So in 2013, which was the first year we started, and it was late in the year, we started the investment strategy. We allocated 50,000 of the 59,000 to the operating account, 9,000 stayed in reserves. 125,000 in 2014, the other approximately 100,000 remained in reserve. So that was just part of the allocation.
I got you now, okay.
So in 2016, it's grown to the point of 175,000. Trend continues. That could approximately be maybe only 50% of what we actually earn.
Okay, thanks, Nash. Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? I think this has been very informative. I'm looking forward to what the recommendations will be, Mike, and, but equally important is the implications of those recommendations, because, sooner or later it's going to affect the tax rate, and if we're going to continue setting a ceiling on our tax rate, for example, at the CPI, then there'll be some implications in terms of what the base budget is. So how we sort that out and how we present that and how we consider that, I think, is as important as the very valid principle about how we should get ourselves to be self-sustaining as we go forward. And I don't think that we should entirely rule out debt. I think that in some cases, if you have an asset that's good for 40 years, trying to save up the cash, it'd be almost like trying to save up cash to buy your house. There are some times where there's a productive use of debt, but we have to be very, very selective in how we do that, because some of that debt servicing comes out of our asset replacement fund if we're replacing an asset with it. So it's going to be challenging. It'll be interesting to see how you approach it, but I know we're in good hands, so I'm looking forward to the reports. Any other questions? All right, then we do have an adjournment here. I have a motion to adjourn. Councillor Kerwin, Councillor Twinney, seconded. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. We're back at 7. Well, I saw it there, so. Yeah. Good. So, let me turn off this thing.